Welcome to Echoes of the Midnight, a channel where every whisper hides a haunting truth. Sit back, turn off the lights, and let the midnight tales pull you into their chilling embrace. The question is, can you make it to the end?
The snow-covered village lay still beneath the cold December sky, its rooftops blanketed in a shimmering layer of white. Twinkling lights adorned every home, casting a warm golden glow onto the frosty streets. Laughter and music echoed softly, carried on the brisk winter wind. It was the kind of Christmas Eve where joy seemed to touch every corner of the world. Or so it seemed. Inside a small cottage near the heart of the village, the glow of a crackling fire lit up a cozy room. A group of children had gathered, their cheeks still flushed from the cold outside, their eyes wide with excitement as they crowded around the hearth. Snow boots were tossed carelessly in the corner, scarves draped over the backs of chairs. "Tell us the story, Jonas," piped up Clara, a girl with braids and a bright red scarf that she hadn't yet taken off. She held a mug of hot cocoa, the steam curling like a ghost around her face. Jonas grinned, the kind of grin that made it clear he was enjoying being the center of attention. He was a wiry boy of 10, with untamed curls and a penchant for spinning tales. "All right," he said, leaning in close. "But you have to promise you won't cry or scream." The children giggled nervously, though a few glanced uneasily at the frost-rimmed windows. Jonas lowered his voice. "Krampus," he began, drawing out the name like a magician about to reveal a trick, "is the dark shadow of Christmas." The room seemed to grow quieter, the only sound the occasional crack of the firewood. "Santa rewards good children," Jonas continued, his tone somber now. "But Krampus comes for the wicked. He punishes those who are selfish, cruel, or who forget what Christmas is really about." The children exchanged uneasy glances, shifting closer to the fire. "What kind of punishment?" whispered young Max, the smallest of the group, his voice trembling slightly. Jonas leaned even closer, the firelight casting eerie shadows across his face. "They say he carries chains that rattle like thunder and a sack where he traps his victims. Once you're in the sack, no one ever sees you again." "That's not real," Clara protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's just an old story." "Maybe," Jonas replied, shrugging casually. "But my grandfather told me he heard the bell one night, years ago. The bell means he's close, and when you hear it, it's already too late." A gust of wind rattled the shutters, and the children jumped. Clara's mug sloshed, spilling cocoa onto her skirt. The fire crackled louder, its embers spitting into the air as if reacting to Jonas's words. "I'm not scared," Clara said defiantly, wiping at the stain. But her eyes betrayed her. The youngest boy, Max, turned to the window, staring at the dark outline of the forest beyond the village. "Does Krampus come out of the woods?" he asked softly. Jonas's smirk faded. "That's where they say he lives, in the deepest, darkest part. He only comes to the village when he's been disturbed." Outside, the wind howled, its mournful cry carrying through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a shutter banged against the side of a house, the sharp sound like the crack of a whip. Farther away, in the village square, Father Ansem stood alone. His long coat flapped in the wind as he stared into the night. The old priest's face was pale and drawn, his breath misting in the frigid air. His gaze lingered on the forest, its towering trees swaying ominously. He clutched the edge of his scarf, whispering words that the wind carried away. "Beware," he murmured, his voice a ghost of sound. "Do not disturb the old ways." The lights strung across the square flickered faintly, but the villagers, lost in their festivities, didn't notice. Inside their homes, they sang songs and exchanged gifts, oblivious to the shadows lengthening at the edge of the woods. Back in the cottage, the children huddled closer together, their laughter quieter now, replaced by uneasy glances at the darkened corners of the room. Jonas sat back, satisfied with the effect of his story. "It's just a tale," Clara muttered again, though this time she didn't sound as sure. Beyond the frosted glass of the window, the black forest loomed, its ancient trees standing silent and watchful. The children didn't notice, but something moved among the shadows, just for a moment. A shape that wasn't there before, and then it was gone. The Johnson family lived in a grand house on the outskirts of the village, its tall, frost-covered windows glowing faintly in the cold December night. Their wealth set them apart from the other villagers, and so did their son, Peter. At 12, Peter had everything a boy could dream of. Piles of toys, a room full of books he never read, and a closet bursting with the finest clothes. Yet, he was never satisfied. He stomped through the house, his sour mood as constant as the biting winter wind. On Christmas Eve, the Johnsons sat in their opulent living room. A massive Christmas tree stood in the corner, draped with sparkling ornaments and gold tinsel. The fire roared in the marble hearth, but even its warmth couldn't melt Peter's scowl. "This is all rubbish," Peter bellowed, flinging a beautifully wrapped box across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud and fell to the floor, unopened. "Peter, please," his mother pleaded, wringing her hands. "These are wonderful gifts. Can't you show a little gratitude?" "Gratitude?" Peter sneered. "For what? Socks. A boring book. I asked for a new game console, not this junk." His father sighed heavily, sinking deeper into his armchair. His mother exchanged a helpless glance with him, but said nothing more. Peter's tantrum escalated as he stormed across the room, his sharp eyes landing on the mantel above the fireplace. There, among the garlands and candles, hung a small, tarnished bell. Its surface was scratched and dull, but something about it seemed to catch the light in an unnatural way. "What's that ugly thing doing up there?" Peter demanded, pointing. "That bell has been in our family for generations," his father said. "It's an heirloom, said to protect us from harm. Your great-grandfather brought it from—" "Stupid old junk," Peter interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. What's the point of keeping it around? Before anyone could stop him, Peter reached up, yanked the bell from its hook, and hurled it to the floor. The sharp crack of metal shattering echoed through the room as the bell broke into jagged pieces. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The fire dimmed, the wind outside ceased, and an unnatural silence fell over the house. Peter stood frozen, staring at the broken bell, with a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Then it came. The sound. A faint, eerie ringing filled the air. It wasn't the bell on the floor, now in fragments, but something deeper, more resonant. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, and nowhere at once, vibrating through the walls and floorboards. Peter's mother gasped, clutching her chest. "The bell! It's broken!" she whispered, her voice trembling. Peter shrugged, though his bravado faltered. "It's just a stupid noise," he muttered, but his voice lacked its usual defiance. The wind outside picked up again, howling louder than before. The windows rattled violently, and the fire sputtered in the hearth as shadows flickered along the walls. They seemed to stretch and twist, taking on shapes that were almost, but not quite, human. "Did you hear that?" Peter's mother whispered, her eyes darting toward the window. "Hear what?" his father asked, though his voice betrayed unease. He rose and peered outside, but the snow-covered yard was empty, the forest beyond dark and still. Yet, something about that stillness felt wrong. Peter laughed nervously, trying to shake off the creeping sense of unease. "See, nothing's out there. You're all just..." The sound of the bell rang again, louder this time. It was closer now, as though it came from within the walls. Peter froze, his smirk fading. His mother reached for his father's arm, her grip tight, but the wind couldn't explain the low growl that followed, a deep, guttural sound that made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift again, darker now and more menacing. Peter backed away from the mantel, his bravado crumbling. Maybe it's broken, but that doesn't mean anything bad is going to happen, right?" His mother didn't answer. Her eyes remained fixed on the jagged pieces of the bell on the floor, as though they might spring to life at any moment. Outside, the shadows deepened, creeping closer to the house. The eerie sound of the bell echoed through the night, carrying with it a chilling promise of what was to come. Morning came slowly to the village, the pale light of dawn struggling to pierce through heavy gray clouds. Snow lay untouched on the ground, save for a faint trail of footprints leading away from the Johnsons' grand home. The house itself stood eerily silent, its door swinging lazily on its hinges in the icy breeze. The festive wreath hung crookedly, its red ribbon fluttering like a warning flag. By midday, the villagers gathered outside, murmuring anxiously. "Have you seen them?" one man asked. No one had. Finally, the bravest among them, old Mr. Carter, pushed the door open and stepped inside. The once grand living room was a scene of unsettling disarray. The Christmas tree leaned awkwardly, its ornaments shattered on the floor. The fire in the hearth had long since gone out, leaving the room cold and lifeless. The claw marks were the first thing Mr. Carter noticed. Long, jagged scratches gouged deep into the walls and floorboards. They crisscrossed the room like the frantic tracks of something inhuman. On the mantelpiece, the villagers spotted it. The bell, whole and unbroken, despite being shattered the night before. Its tarnished surface gleamed faintly, as though mocking them. "They're gone," Mr. Carter whispered. "All of them." The whispers began almost immediately, spreading like wildfire through the village. "It's Krampus," said an old woman, her voice trembling. "He's come for the wicked. The boy brought this curse upon us." Some laughed nervously, dismissing her words as foolish superstition. "It's probably wolves," a farmer suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Others murmured about robbers or wild animals, anything to explain the unexplainable. But deep down, everyone felt it. A chill that went beyond the winter cold, settling like a shadow over their hearts. That night, as snow fell softly over the village, the bell rang again. Faint and distant, it echoed through the darkness, like a ghostly whisper. At first, the villagers convinced themselves it was just the wind or the clanging of a far-off church bell. But when the Wilson family disappeared the following morning, leaving behind only claw marks and eerie silence, their fragile denial crumbled. Jonas watched the growing unease from his small bedroom window. His breath fogged the glass as he peered into the woods that bordered the village. By day, the forest was a stark collection of bare trees and snow-covered branches. But at night, it became something else entirely. A labyrinth of shadows and shifting shapes. The third night, Jonas saw it. A shadow moved among the trees, tall and unnatural, its long limbs bending at impossible angles. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but as the moon emerged from behind the clouds, he saw it clearly. The figure stood still, as though watching, before retreating deeper into the woods. "We have to do something," he told his parents at dinner, his voice trembling. "Something," they both said. "Krampus is here. He's taking people." His father chuckled nervously, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's just a story, Jonas. You've been listening to too many tales by the fire." "It's not just a story," Jonas insisted, his voice rising. "I saw something in the woods." "Enough," his mother said gently, though her hands trembled as she set down her fork. "It's late. Go to bed." But Jonas couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, his blanket wrapped tightly around him, watching the wind. Every now and then, the faint sound of the bell would carry on the wind, sending shivers down his spine. The shadows in the woods seemed to inch closer, their movements deliberate and alive. Sometime past midnight, he saw it again. The same twisted figure, now closer to the edge of the forest. For a moment, it turned toward the village, and though Jonas couldn't see its face, he felt its gaze lock onto him. He scrambled away from the window, his heart pounding. Clutching his blanket, he huddled on the floor, too afraid to look again. The bell rang once more, louder now, and Jonas could have sworn he heard something else beneath it. A deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The village was no longer safe. Christmas Eve arrived, but it brought no joy to the snow-covered village. The festive cheer that once lit up the streets was now a distant memory, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating fear. Windows were shuttered tightly, and doors were bolted against the unknown. The usual carols and laughter had been replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. Not even the village's stray dogs ventured into the streets. The bell rang again. Its haunting sound echoed through the frozen night, faint but relentless, carried on the icy wind like a mournful wail. The villagers huddled in their homes, clutching their loved ones, their prayers whispered but unspoken. None dared to speak of what the sound truly meant. Jonas couldn't take it anymore. Every ring of the bell felt like a knife twisting deeper into his chest. Clutching a lantern in his trembling hands, he wrapped his scarf tightly around his neck and pushed open the door to his family's home. The cold struck him like a physical blow, but he didn't falter. He had to know. He had to stop it. "Jonas, where are you going?" his mother called, but her voice cracked with fear. She stood frozen in the doorway, unwilling to follow him. "I have to stop this," Jonas replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "It won't end unless someone does something." The village square was deathly still, the snow crunching under his boots, the only sound apart from the constant, ghostly chime of the bell. His lantern cast flickering shadows on the buildings, their shapes twisting and writhing like living things. He stopped in the middle of the square and turned slowly, scanning the darkened streets. Then, from the shadows it came, a figure emerged from the forest at the edge of the village, its immense size dwarfing the surrounding trees. Krampus. His twisted horns scraped the low-hanging branches as he stepped into the moonlight, his red eyes glowing like embers in the dark. His chains rattled with each step, the sound sharp and metallic against the frozen air. Behind him, he dragged a large, writhing sack. Muffled cries came from within, though Jonas couldn't tell if they were human. Jonas's breath hitched, his instincts screaming at him to run, but he held his ground. His fingers tightened around the lantern's handle, though his knuckles had turned white with fear. Krampus stopped just outside the square, tilting his monstrous head as though sizing up the boy. His claws flexed, gleaming in the faint light, and a low, guttural growl rumbled deep within his chest. Jonas took a shaky step forward. "Take me," he said, his voice louder than he expected. "Spare the others. Take me." Krampus tilted his head further, his glowing eyes narrowing as though he were considering the boy's words. The bells ringing suddenly ceased, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its place. The world seemed to hold its breath. The monster stepped closer, his massive form casting an oppressive shadow over Jonas. The ground seemed to tremble beneath him as he stopped just feet away. His clawed hand reached out slowly, the sharp tips inches from Jonas's face. Jonas flinched, but didn't move. His heart pounded so loudly he was certain Krampus could hear it. "Do it," he whispered, though his voice cracked. "Take me." Krampus froze. For a long, agonizing moment, he stood there, his claws suspended in the air. Then, something shifted in his expression. Or was it Jonas's imagination? The growl in his chest fading to silence, his chains slackened, falling still. Jonas couldn't tell if the monster was accepting his offer or rejecting it. He closed his eyes, bracing for the end, the cold of the night seeping into his very bones. The silence pressed down on him, heavier than any noise could be. When he opened his eyes, Krampus was gone. The square was empty. The snow lay undisturbed except for Jonas's own footprints. The lantern's light flickered weakly, and for the first time that night, the air felt still. Jonas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced around, expecting to see Krampus lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. Only the faint echo of the bell, now distant and fading, lingered on the wind. As Jonas turned to head back to his house, he noticed something on the ground where Krampus had stood. A single tarnished bell lay in the snow, its surface scratched and worn. He picked it up hesitantly, its metal cold against his palm. The moment his fingers closed around it, a faint growl echoed in his mind, sending shivers down his spine. The village was safe, for now. But deep in the forest, where the shadows were darkest, Krampus's red eyes still burned. When Jonas opened his eyes, the square was empty. The snow lay pristine and untouched, as if the events of the night had been nothing but a terrible dream. The lantern he'd carried flickered weakly at his feet, its light barely piercing the darkness. The only sound was the soft whistle of the wind weaving through the trees. Jonas staggered to his feet, clutching his chest. His heart still raced, and his limbs felt like lead, and walked into the library. He glanced around, expecting to see Krampus lurking in the shadows, but the towering figure was nowhere to be found. Only the faint echo of the bell lingered in the air, so distant now that it felt like a memory. The creak of a door broke the silence. Slowly, one by one, the villagers emerged from their homes. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear and guilt. They had seen the monster, if not with their own eyes, then in their dreams. Krampus had not spared them entirely. His presence had seeped into their minds, showing them the weight of their greed, their selfishness, and the harm they had caused one another. Jonas stood in the center of the square, his small figure illuminated by the weak lantern light. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The villagers knew what he had done, the sacrifice he had been willing to make. A boy, barely old enough to shoulder the responsibility, had faced down the monster they had called upon themselves. "We did this," whispered old Mr. Carter, his voice trembling. "It was us, our greed, our cruelty. We brought him here." A murmur spread through the crowd, and tears glistened in more than a few eyes. The weight of their actions pressed down on them like the snow that covered their village. Jonas's mother rushed forward, pulling her son into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I should have believed you." The priest stepped forward, his expression grave but resolute. "Krampus only comes where he is invited. Not with words, but with deeds. If we are to keep him away, we must change." The villagers nodded solemnly. That night, they made a vow, not just to each other, but to the spirit of Christmas itself. They would set aside their petty grievances, their selfish desires, and their indifference. They would become better, kinder, more generous. In the weeks that followed, the village transformed. Neighbors helped one another without hesitation, sharing food, warmth, and laughter. The once isolated Johnson house, empty since that fateful night, became a place for gatherings and celebrations, a symbol of their new unity. The cold, dark silence that had gripped the village was replaced by the warmth of community, but the memory of Krampus never truly left them. Though the villagers no longer spoke of that night, the fear lingered. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind was just right, they could hear the faint sound of a bell. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to send shivers down their spines. Jonas kept the tarnished bell he had found in the snow. He didn't tell anyone about it, not even his parents. It sat in a small wooden box under his bed, wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. Yet sometimes he could still hear it, ringing faintly in the dead of night. The forest, too, seemed changed. It remained dark and imposing, its shadows longer and deeper than before. Hunters refused to enter, their instincts warning them away. Children no longer played near its edges, and even the animals seemed to avoid it. On moonless nights, a few villagers claimed they saw something moving among the trees. A towering silhouette with horns that seemed to watch and wait. One cold evening, Jonas sat by his window, staring at the forest. The moon hung low, casting a pale glow over the treetops. He thought of Krampus, of the monstrous figure that had stood before him. Was it truly gone? Or was it simply waiting for another invitation? A gust of wind rattled the shutters, and for a brief moment, Jonas thought he saw red eyes glowing in the darkness. He blinked, and they were gone. But the faint sound of a bell drifted through the air, and he knew Krampus was still watching. The boy turned back to his room, closing the curtains tightly. He climbed into bed, clutching the blanket around him. The bell under his bed was silent now, but its weight seemed heavier than ever. In the heart of the forest, where the shadows were deepest, Krampus waited. His chains lay still, his sack empty for now, but his red eyes burned with a patient hunger, and the bell at his side gleamed in the darkness. He would return. Not today, Not tomorrow, but one day. For wherever greed and selfishness festered, he would find his way back, and the villagers would hear the bell once more.
Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe for more. See you next time.